You think the most dangerous thing in the Sahara is sandstorms and the thirst that drives people mad. What about a living green swamp the size of an entire country? One that moves on its own and swallows massive ships whole forever. Today we're sailing down the Great Nile River. You'll see dried up rivers buried deep beneath the scorching sand. Massive concrete walls that force people to saw ancient temples into pieces. And at the end, you'll learn about an invisible threat. Salt water that's poisoning fresh water right now. Slowly swallowing an entire country and turning green fields into a dead white wasteland. In the 19th century, several major expeditions set out into the heart of Africa to solve the era's biggest geographic mystery. Explorers had seen a mighty river in Egypt that fed an entire civilization, but no one understood where such a massive volume of water came from. For months, expeditions pushed south through sun-scorched wastelands that hadn't seen a drop of rain in years. Sand jammed their equipment. People lost their minds to optical illusions and relentless thirst. By all logic, the water should have soaked into the ground or evaporated under the blazing sun. But the Nile kept flowing, never losing its power. The riverbed never shrank, as if the river were being fed by some invisible source. Hidden beneath the scorching dunes, local legends claimed the river began in a giant underground ocean, hidden by the gods from human eyes so no one could control the source of life. In reality, the truth turned out to be far more complex and far more impressive than any myth. The Nile survives in the desert thanks to a dual feed system that works like a natural pump. The White Nile begins far south at the equator, near Africa's Great Lakes, flowing slowly and providing a steady baseline of water all year round. The secret to surviving the summer heat lies in the Blue Nile. It begins in the Ethiopian highlands, where massive monsoon rains pound the mountains every summer with such force that they become a raging torrent, carrying millions of cubic meters of water into the desert. This seasonal surge is so powerful it punches straight through the Sahara, like a fire hydrant blasting at full force, leaving the sun no chance to evaporate at all. But before these two streams can join forces, one of them has to pass through a treacherous place, a place that nearly became the river's own silent grave. In 1839, a massive fleet sent by the Egyptian ruler tried to push toward the river's source and ran into an impossible obstacle. In what is now South Sudan, the riverbed suddenly vanished, dissolving into an endless sea of green reeds and towering papyrus. Dozens of ships found themselves trapped in a vast maze of floating islands. The water here didn't flow, it stagnated, giving off a thick smell of decay. The air was so heavy with vapor and biting insects that breathing itself became a struggle. Crews wandered the endless swamp for weeks, unable to find the main channel. Many massive vessels were lost there forever, crushed by the dense biomass that seemed to live a life of its own, shifting and changing shape every day. For a long time, sailors believed the place was cursed, marking the edge of the known world. Around campfires, they told stories of prehistoric creatures lurking in the murky, dark water. Many believed the swamp itself had a primal will, deliberately shifting its thorny reed islands to confuse intruders and trap them there forever. This place is called the Sud, one of the largest freshwater swamps on Earth, roughly the size of a small European country. When the White Nile's flow reaches here, the river loses its banks and spreads uncontrollably across a vast, flat plain. Under the scorching equatorial sun and with such a sluggish current, a staggering amount of water evaporates. Roughly half of the entire White Nile's flow simply vanishes into the atmosphere. But the Sud plays another role too. It's a giant natural sponge. During the brutal rainy season, the swamp soaks up the excess water, preventing catastrophic flooding downstream. The vegetation here is so dense it creates its own self-contained microclimate. The shade from the papyrus cools the surface and keeps the water from boiling under the sun. In the late 20th century, scientists pointed radar satellites at the Sahara, instruments capable of seeing several meters into the dry sand, almost like an X-ray. When researchers got the first images back and decoded them, they could barely believe their eyes. Right beneath the lifeless yellow dunes, where today there's nothing but hot dust and rock, lay a colossal network of dried up riverbeds. Traces of massive ancient rivers, miles wide, that once merged with the Nile or ran alongside it, forming a water system many times larger than anything we see today. The radar images revealed the truth about what's known as the Paleo Nile. About 100,000 years ago, Earth's climate was completely different. North Africa was a vast, blooming savanna with regular rainfall and dozens of mighty rivers. When the climate pendulum swung and the Sahara began turning into a dry furnace, almost all of these waterways vanish forever. The Nile survived through sheer geological luck. The Ethiopian highlands were slowly rising due to tectonic plate movement. This uplift created a steep slope that gave the Blue Nile's current tremendous speed and destructive force. Over millennia, millions of tons of rushing water carved through solid rock, cutting a deep canyon. Because the Nile's bed dug so deep into solid rock, its surface ended up shielded from the desert's drying winds by tall banks. This dramatically reduced the surface area exposed to evaporation. The river essentially hid from the Sahara inside its own canyon, and that's why it survived. Where dozens of other rivers died. In the mid-20th century, humans decided to tame a river that had outlasted deserts and tectonic shifts. Ancient temples, tall as multi-story buildings, had to be sawed into thousands of blocks and hauled high into the mountains, so they wouldn't vanish beneath an artificial sea rapidly swallowing the valley. Ordinary people watched anxiously as the gray concrete barrier grew taller. Villagers whispered that damming a sacred river would anger the ancient forces that had governed its waters since time began. The project was called the Swan Dam. From an engineering standpoint, it was an unqualified triumph. Behind the concrete wall, a reservoir nearly 500 kilometers long formed. But along with the excess water, the dam also brought something just as important to a dead stop. The Nile's famous silt. For thousands of years, the river's powerful current carried millions of tons of dark, mineral-rich soil down from the mountains of Ethiopia. Now, all that material piles up year after year on the reservoir floor, unable to pass through the dam. Cut off from this natural replenishment, farmers are forced to use thousands of tons of chemical fertilizer, which is slowly poisoning the land. A few years ago, fresh satellite images of Ethiopia revealed a massive new structure that set off alarm bells at the highest levels of neighboring governments. Right on the Blue Nile, the very branch that supplies the river with the lion's share of its water, a colossal new dam began rising at breakneck speed. This time, construction wasn't happening safely downstream, but right at the source. Diplomatic relations in the region stretched to the breaking point. Tense negotiations began. Whoever controls this switch holds the fate of more than 100 million people living downstream. If the reservoir filled too quickly, the riverbed would dry up within months, exposing cracked mud, and Africa's mighty, life-giving river would shrink into a chain of stinking, drying puddles. This structure is known as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. On paper, it's a purely economic hydroelectric project, one capable of lifting millions of people out of darkness and poverty. But the real problem lies in unforgiving physics. To get the turbine spinning, the reservoir, roughly the size of a small sea, has to be filled with tens of cubic kilometers of water. And as that water spends years accumulating in the highland reservoir, it physically cannot reach Egypt. What's more, a massive artificial lake under a blazing sun means millions of tons of water will simply evaporate every year, permanently lost from the river's balance. Engineers promise to fill the reservoir slowly and carefully, but climate change is making rainfall unpredictable. The volume of fresh water making it through the Sahara is shrinking, and this quiet but deadly chain reaction has already reached the very end of the river's journey. Over the past few decades, farmers in the picturesque Nile Delta have run into something baffling and frightening. Bountiful harvests began dying right where they stood. Land that had fed entire empires for centuries became coated in a thick white crust. When people tried drinking from old, trusted wells, they spat the water back out in horror. It had turned unbearably bitter and salty. Fertile soil began crumbling to dust right in their hands, and the coastline itself visibly shifted, as if some invisible force were slowly, inch by inch, biting off pieces of blooming land and dragging them under cold water. In hydrology, this process is called saltwater intrusion, and it's a direct consequence of our own interference with the river. The Nile Delta is a stretch of land the river itself built up over millennia from Ethiopian silt. That silt constantly pushed the sea back, but after the concrete dams went up, fresh building material stopped arriving. Cut off from a steady supply of new sediment, the delta began sinking and slowly eroding under the pounding of ocean waves. At the same time, global sea levels are rising due to climate change. As a result, the salty waters of the Mediterranean are advancing, seeping deep underground and poisoning freshwater aquifers. The land is becoming saturated with caustic salt, making it impossible to grow even the hardiest crops, and turning wells into poison. The river loses its strength right at the very end of its journey, no longer able to hold back the ocean's advance. The sea is slowly, but absolutely inevitably, swallowing one of the most fertile and ancient regions on the planet. We've covered an incredible journey. We saw the roaring waterfalls of the Ethiopian highlands and the green maze of the sun, where time seems to stop. We traced ancient riverbeds buried in the scorching sands of the Sahara, watched concrete walls choke off the planet's arteries, and saw the ocean slowly eating away at the coastline with salt. For tens of thousands of years, the Nile survived in a temperature hell, thanks to nature's perfectly tuned balance, powerful seasonal rains, and a deep stone channel carved out by time. But the modern world has proven more complicated than any natural threat. We've learned to build towering concrete walls capable of stopping, in seconds, power that took millennia to build up. We think we've tamed the elements, but every intervention like this shatters a fragile natural balance. One decision made in some office can turn thousand-year-old, blooming oases into lifeless, salt-poisoned wastelands. We're reshaping the physical map of our planet faster than we can grasp the cost of our own actions. The story of this great African river is the clearest and most unsettling proof of that. If you enjoyed diving into these mysteries, hit like. It's the best way to support the channel. Subscribe to keep learning about the hidden forces shaping our world.